You ever have one of those moments when the past doesn't just knock on your door? It kicks it wide open, demanding answers you weren't ready to give. That's what it felt like the day I bought my grandfather's lakefront mansion. It was a place wrapped in mystery. The kind of house people whispered about when driving past. The windows had been boarded for decades. Porch lights dangled loose from their wires. The old boathouse sagged into the lake like it was too tired to keep standing. Folks around town called it the ghost house. But to me, it was family. That house was the heart of my childhood summers. I could still hear the sound of my grandfather's laughter echoing across the dock. Smell the firewood smoke curling out from the old stone chimney. And picture the 4th of July when my cousins and I ran barefoot on the lawn, sparklers in hand. The house was broken, sure, but it wasn't dead. I wasn't about to let it die, so I did what nobody else dared to do. I bought it back. With my own money, with my own hands, and I swore to restore it, board by board, window by window, until the lakefront mansion looked the way it did in my memories. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that saving my grandfather's house was going to drag me into a war, not just with a few nosy neighbors, not just with some busybody down the road. No. With the HOA, it started 3 weeks after. I signed the papers. I had just come back from the hardware store, arms full of paint buckets, nails, and wood stain. The late afternoon sun was laying gold streaks across the lake, and for a moment I stood there on the porch, just soaking it in. That's when I saw them. A group of people standing at the edge of the gravel driveway, clipboards in hand, arms folded, 3 men in polo shirts. One woman with sharp sunglasses that didn't hide the glare in her eyes. And at the front, a short man with a smug little smirk. The HOA? Afternoon, I said, trying to be neighborly. Can I help you folks? The man with the smirk stepped forward, flipping through some papers. You must be the new owner. That's right, I said. This was my grandfather's place. Well, he said, raising his eyebrows, then you must know why we're here. I frowned. No. Why? He tapped his clipboard. You owe back dues. Since 1974? I laughed because I thought it was a joke. Some kind of bizarre, small-town welcome prank. But nobody else was laughing. The woman with the sunglasses crossed her arms tighter. One of the polo shirt guys muttered something about delinquent accounts. The smug man handed me a thick folder of papers. As of this date, the property at 117 Lakeshore Drive has accumulated dues, fines, and penalties totaling. He paused, making a show of it. $192,000. I nearly dropped the paint cans right there on the porch. You've got to be kidding me, I said. Not at all, the man replied smoothly. As the current owner, the responsibility falls to you. We expect payment or you'll face legal action. Now let me pause here for a second. Imagine you're standing in front of your family's legacy, the home your grandfather built with his own hands, the home your parents danced in as teenagers, the home that carried your childhood laughter in its walls, and somebody in a pressed polo shirt has the audacity to tell you that unless you pay nearly $200,000 in imaginary debt, you don't deserve to keep it. That's not just money. That's robbery dressed up in legal words. But worse than that, it was an attack on my family. I didn't let them see me shake. Instead, I squared my shoulders and said, this house has been empty for decades. Nobody has lived here since my grandfather passed. You mean to tell me you've been stacking dues on a boarded-up property since 1974? The smug man gave me a cold smile. Rules are rules. And that's when the lady with the sunglasses leaned forward and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, you should have left it to rot. That one sentence hit harder than any threat, because what she meant was, you should have let your family's memory die. You should have let this house collapse into dust. You had no right to bring it back to life, and that was personal. That night, I sat on the porch steps, folder of so-called back dues in my lap. The crickets chirped around me. The lake glistened under the moonlight. I flipped through page after page of bogus charges. 1975, lawn not maintained. 1978, fence in disrepair. Dock considered unsafe. I almost laughed. My grandfather had been gone for 10 years by then. Who exactly were they finding? A ghost? But the deeper I went, the angrier I got, because I realized this wasn't just incompetence. This was deliberate. They had kept the charges alive all these years, waiting, watching, hoping someone in the family would, eventually, reclaim the house so they could swoop in like vultures. They weren't after dues. They were after the house itself. The next morning I drove into town. I stopped at the diner, the one with faded red stools and the smell of bacon grease in the air. As soon as I walked in, I could feel the eyes on me. Neighbors, old-timers, folks who had seen me running barefoot along the docks as a kid. One man lowered his newspaper and said, "Heard the HOA paid you a visit." I froze. Word travels fast. He gave a bitter chuckle. Son, around here, it travels faster than the wind. The waitress Mary, who used to sneak us extra milkshakes when we were kids, leaned close and whispered, "They did the same thing to the Millers and the Donovans. Tried to scare them off their own property." I frowned. "And what happened to them?" She gave me a look that sent a chill down my spine. "They don't live here anymore." At the time I walked out of that diner, I knew one thing for sure. The HOA. It wasn't just a nuisance. They were a predator, and they had just marked me as their next target that night. I stayed up late working on the mansion, hammering loose boards, scraping away decades of paint. Every strike of the hammer felt like a vow. This house will stand again. No HOA is going to take it from me. But as I worked, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, moving across the lawn. I froze. Hammer in hand, someone was out there watching. When I swung the porch light toward the yard, I caught a glimpse of a figure slipping behind the trees. And then, like a bad omen, the light flickered and went out. That's when I realized this wasn't just about paperwork. The HOA was going to play fair. They wanted me gone, and they weren't above using the dark to make it happen. You ever notice how whispers carry louder than shouts in a small town? That week, everywhere I went, I could feel the whispers following me. At the hardware store, at the post office, even at church, where the stained glass cast rainbows across the pews, but couldn't cover the way folks leaned close and muttered when I walked past. "They say he owes near 200,000. Should have left that place alone. HOA won't let him keep it, you'll see." The mansion wasn't just a house anymore. It had become gossip, and gossip in this town spread like a brush fire. Every evening, after another long day of scraping walls or fixing the dock, I'd sit on the porch steps and look out at the water. The lake would glow orange with sunset, rippling like a memory. I thought about my grandfather then. He was the kind of man who believed in handshakes over contracts. In building fences, not to keep people out, but to keep kids safe inside. He'd sit me on his lap in the rocking chair and tell me, "Respect isn't given, boy. It's earned." And I couldn't help but wonder, what would he say now if he saw a group of neighbors in polo shirts trying to bully his family out of the house he built with his bare hands? I think he'd tell me to stand my ground, and that's exactly what I intended to do. But standing your ground means you're going to draw fire, and fire came in the form of Karen. Now every town has at least one. You know the type? The self-declared queen of the block? Knows everybody's business. Thinks rules were made for her to enforce, but never to follow. Karen lived 2 houses down from the mansion, in a place that looked like it had been ripped straight out of a catalog. Fresh mulch, perfectly trimmed hedges, American flag always at the exact same height. And one morning, as I was repainting the front porch columns, I heard the sound of heels clacking down the gravel. I turned just in time to see her marching up the driveway, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. "Excuse me," she said, in that tone that wasn't really asking anything. "Yes?" I said, setting down my brush. "You can't paint that color," she said flatly, pointing at the deep lake blue shade I had chosen. I blinked. "Excuse me? It's against HOA guidelines. Houses on this street must be beige, cream, or white." She crossed her arms like she had just delivered a royal decree. I couldn't help but laugh. "Lady, this house hasn't had a coat of paint since Nixon was president. I think it'll survive a little blue." Her lips tightened. You won't be laughing when we fine you for non-compliance. That word fine hung in the air like a slap. I stepped closer, paint still dripping from the brush in my hand. This house belonged to my grandfather. It's my property now, and I'll paint it any color I damn well please. Karen gasped like I'd just cursed in church. She spun on her heel, muttering, "We'll see about that." 2 days later, I came home from town to find a bright yellow notice nailed to the front door. Violation. Unauthorized paint color. Penalty. $500. I ripped it down so hard the nail nearly came out with it. That was their game. Nickel-and-dime harassment. Paper cuts designed to bleed me dry. And it wasn't just paint. The next week, another notice. Grass too high, $250. Then, improper trash bins, $100. Then, boat dock not up to standards, $750. Each one more ridiculous than the last, and every time. I saw Karen standing at her window, arms folded. Watching, she wasn't just a neighbor. She was their lookout, their enforcer, their Karen-in-chief. But here's the thing about trying to intimidate us. Someone who's restoring their family's legacy. Every notice they posted, every petty fine they threw at me, only fueled the fire in my chest. I wasn't about to be bullied out of the house my grandfather built, and I sure as hell wasn't going to let Karen win. One evening, as I hammered fresh boards into the dock, a couple of kids rode by on bikes. They slowed down, staring wide-eyed at the old mansion. One of them whispered, "That's the haunted house." The other said, "No, that's where the HOA kicked everybody out." I set down my hammer and called out gently, "Hey kids, this house isn't haunted. It's mine. My family built it." They looked at me like they didn't know whether to believe it. And right then, I realized what the HOA was doing. They weren't just trying to take the house. They were rewriting its story, turning my family's home into a cautionary tale that made me more determined than ever to fight back. But the fight wasn't going to be easy, because late one night, as I sat sorting through the back dues folder by the dim glow of a lantern, I found something that made my stomach turn. Buried between decades of bogus charges was a handwritten note. Not official. Not typed. Just scrawled in pen, property subject to lien if unpaid by 2025. Board vote pending, that was this year, and suddenly. It all made sense. The reason they waited until I bought the place. The reason Karen had been so relentless. They didn't want the dues. They wanted to seize the mansion. The next morning, I drove to the county clerk's office. The building smelled of dust and old books. The kind of place where secrets hid in filing cabinets. I asked to see the deed records for 117 Lakeshore Drive. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "That's the old Marshall place, isn't it?" "That's right," I said. "It was my grandfather's." "Of course." She wheeled out a cart stacked with ledgers so heavy the dust puffed up. When she set them down, and as I flipped through page after page, tracing signatures back nearly 50 years, one thing became crystal clear. The mansion was never part of the HOA, not in 1974. Not ever. My grandfather had specifically written it into the deed. Property is to remain independent. Not subject to association rules. I sat back, stunned. My hands trembled against the yellowed paper. The HOA's entire claim was a lie. But before I could even begin to celebrate, the sound of heels clicked behind me. I turned, and there she was, Karen standing in the county clerk's office, arms folded, eyes blazing. Well, she said, voice dripping with venom. "Looks like somebody's been digging where they shouldn't." I closed the ledger slowly, my jaw tight. "What are you doing here?" I asked. She smirked. "Let's just say, I have friends on the board, and you'd better watch yourself, because some things are better left buried." With that, she spun and walked out, her heels echoing like warning shots down the marble hallway. I stood there for a long time, heart pounding, the truth burning in my hands. The HOA had lied. They'd been scheming for decades to take the mansion. And now Karen knew I was on to them. The war had officially begun, and I had no idea how far they'd go to win that night. As I locked up the mansion, I heard it again movement outside. Only this time, it wasn't just a shadow slipping through the trees. It was voices low, hushed, plotting, and then clear as day. One phrase cut through the night will make him leave. One way or another. The first thing I learned in life is that a house with history is a way of hiding its secrets in plain sight. Every floorboard, every corner, every faded photograph whispered clues if you were willing to listen. And after the run-in with Karen, I decided I was done waiting. I wasn't going to let the HOA bulldoze my family's legacy. It was time to fight back. I started small, night after night. After the mansion had gone dark and the lake shimmered silver under the moon, I'd pore over the HOA paperwork, the so-called back dues folders, and the county records I had pulled. I marked inconsistencies with a pencil. Every page told a story sometimes. Two conflicting ones. One ledger claimed dues from 1,978. Another ledger had the property listed as exempt from HOA fees in 1,980. It didn't take long before the pattern became clear. Someone had been manipulating the records. The next day, I went to the town library. I dug into old newspapers, hoping to find articles, announcements, anything that might shed light on past HOA board actions. There it was. A small notice from 1984, board approves, liens on properties not paying HOA dues. Homeowners can appeal within 30 days. It's nothing unusual, except my grandfather's name was listed among the appealed properties, and the last line of the notice, appeal denied due to incomplete documentation. I felt a chill run down my spine. Incomplete documentation? My grandfather had always kept meticulous records. There was no way this was true that evening. I returned to the mansion and rummaged through the attic. They're under layers of dust and cobwebs. I found my grandfather's old files. Letters, deeds, receipts. In a journal, it was like finding a buried treasure. I flipped it open and began reading. These people cannot be trusted. They want what is not theirs. I will never allow my family's home to fall into their hands. If I am gone, let the papers show the property is independent, not subject to any HOA. My grandfather had anticipated this battle decades ago, and he had documented everything to protect us. Armed with this evidence, I knew I needed more proof that the HOA wasn't just mistaken, but corrupt. I reached out to old-timers in town, people who remembered the mansion and my grandfather's dealings with the HOA. One man, Mr. Thompson, a retired lawyer who had once been on the board, invited me to his house. He shuffled through yellowed files and sighed heavily. They'd been padding dues for years, he admitted. It wasn't just a bookkeeping error. The board at the time, they were greedy. They saw anyone leaving the neighborhood as a threat. And if a property came up for sale, they'd manufacture debt to scare off the buyer. He paused. Your grandfather knew it. That's why he made the house independent. But the current board, Karen's friends, they don't care. They think rules are just tools to get what they want. Mr. Thompson's house feeling a mix of rage and determination. Rage, because the HOA had tried to steal my grandfather's. Legacy determination, because now I had the proof to stop them. Over the next week, I gathered everything. The original deed proving independence from HOA rules. My grandfather's journal and letters. Newspaper clippings and town records showing board manipulation. Statements from neighbors who had been bullied by the HOA in the past. Piece by piece. The story became undeniable. And the more I dug, the more I realized just how far they'd go to cover their tracks. That's when the intimidation escalated. One night, I returned to the mansion to find the gate latch forced open. My tools were scattered, footprints in the mud. No note. No explanation. Just a silent threat. Then Karen showed up again, this time leaning on the mailbox. Looking through other people's business now? She sneered. I didn't flinch. I'm looking at what's mine. Her lips curled in a sneer. You'll see. They always get what they want in this town. But I knew differently, and I was ready to prove it. I called a meeting with a few trusted neighbors, people who had also suffered under the HOA's heavy hand. We gathered in the old town hall, a small brick building smelling of varnish and history. I laid out everything, the manipulated ledgers, my grandfather's documents, the newspaper clippings. Murmurs spread across the room. Finally, one woman whispered, "Someone's standing up to them." Another man added, "We've been talking quietly for years, afraid of retaliation, but maybe it's time." That night I realized the mansion had become more than just my family home. It was a symbol of resilience, of standing up to bullies, of fighting for what's right. And I wasn't going to fight alone. The next day, I contacted a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. She was skeptical at first, of course. "Most people just pay up," she said, "or move." I shook my head. Not this time. Not this house. Not this family. After reviewing the documents, she nodded slowly. "You have everything you need to challenge them in court. They're out of line, and there's a paper trail proving it." It felt like a small victory. But the fight wasn't over. Meanwhile, Karen didn't give up either. She started showing up at the mansion in the mornings, snapping photos of anything she could. Porch lights, paint color, dock alignment. Even the way I stacked firewood. I caught her one afternoon trying to peek through a window. "You're crazy," she yelled when I confronted her. "The board will have you out here before summer?" I smiled coldly. "Not this house. Not today." And came the day I received an email that made my stomach churn. Board vote scheduled. Potential lien. Immediate action required. It was the HOA's official notice. They were trying to rush me. Scare me into compliance before I could present my evidence. I leaned back in my chair, looking at the lake beyond the mansion, and I realized something. Fear wasn't going to win this battle. Knowledge would. Proof would. And the truth always carries weight heavier than any fabricated fine. I spent the next several nights preparing my case, organizing documents, creating timelines, and gathering witnesses. By the time the board meeting arrived, I was ready. Karen showed up, of course, all smiles and fake civility, whispering into the ears of board members. But I wasn't intimidated. I walked into the room with my grandfather's journal in hand, the deed tucked under my arm, and a folder of irrefutable evidence on the table. I could see their smug expressions, faltering as I began presenting my case. Each page I showed, each statement I read, their confidence began to crumble. "Your claims of back dues are fraudulent," I said, voice calm but firm. "The property has never been subject to HOA rules. Your fines are baseless, and your board has knowingly attempted to manipulate records for decades." A hush fell over the room. Karen's jaw tightened. She opened her mouth, probably to argue, but no words came out. One by one, neighbors and witnesses spoke up. "Your board tried the same with my property," said an older man. "We all paid under protest. But this is the first time someone's actually shown proof." The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And then, the final blow. I placed my grandfather's journal on the table, opened to the page that read, "This property shall remain independent. Any claim otherwise is invalid." The room went silent. Even the HOA attorney, a stiff man in a gray suit, swallowed hard. It was in that moment I realized something profound. The fight wasn't just about money or paint or fines. It was about justice. It was about family. It was about preserving dignity. And that truth, that unwavering, undeniable truth, could not be silenced. The morning of the big showdown, I couldn't sleep. The lake was calm, the mist curling over the water like it was holding its breath. I walked the mansion's perimeter, checking the dock, the paint, the porch lights I had just fixed. Everything felt surreal. After months of fighting paperwork, dodging harassment, and watching Karen's smug face everywhere, the final confrontation was here. And somehow, walking through the familiar halls of my grandfather's house, I felt a mixture of fear, pride, and anticipation. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was personal. I arrived at the community center an hour early. The room was buzzing. Neighbors whispered excitedly, some leaning on canes, some clutching coffee cups. A few recognized me from my childhood, and I could see surprise flicker in their eyes. Karen arrived next, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. She wore that same self-satisfied smirk, sunglasses perched on her head like she owned the place. She had no idea the tide had already turned. The board shuffled in, paperwork in hand. They looked confident, arrogant, until I walked in. I carried the evidence folder. My grandfather's journal, the deed, and statements from witnesses. I placed everything on the table in front of the board. No introductions. No small talk. Just truth. I began, calmly but firmly. This mansion belongs to my family. It has always belonged to my family. Your claims of back dues are fraudulent, baseless, and frankly illegal. I flipped open the deed. Here's the proof. This property was explicitly declared independent of any HOA association. And here, I held up the journal, is my grandfather's note, written to protect it from people like you. Karen's smile faltered. I could see her whispering into the ear of one of the board members, panic barely hidden behind practiced calm. As I laid out the timeline, 50 years of fabricated charges, the board's deliberate attempts to bully previous owners, and witness statements from townspeople, the room went quiet. The weight of decades of lies pressed down on them, one by one. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. Their confident air was slipping. And then came the part that made Karen visibly tremble. I read aloud, board vote pending. Property subject to lien. Immediate action required. And yet, I continued, all of this was done while knowing the property was legally independent. You threatened my family, attempted to intimidate us, and harassed me personally. Karen, you even showed up multiple times trying to spy, intimidate, and enforce rules that don't apply. That's harassment. Plain and simple. There was a moment along, heavy pause where it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Then one of the neighbors stood up. It's true. I've been here 40 years, and I've seen them do this to half the street. Nobody dared fight back. You've done what no one else has. Another woman added, and it's about time. We all know the truth. Karen's face went pale. She opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Her usual venomous confidence was gone. Even the board attorney cleared his throat uncomfortably. By the end of the meeting, the HOA board had no choice. All fines were revoked. All claims of back dues nullified. Karen was forced to apologize begrudgingly before. The community neighbors who had whispered behind closed doors were now nodding. Some smiling, others shaking their heads at the audacity of the HOA. Justice had been served, and I had my grandfather's legacy back. The next week, I returned to the mansion. The lake reflected a brilliant sunrise, orange and gold melting into the water. I climbed onto the dock, the board sturdy underfoot. I could hear the faint sound of birdsong and the gentle lap of waves against the shore. I walked through each room. Every beam, every window, every faded wall carried memories of laughter, of summers spent running barefoot with cousins, of firewood smoke curling into the sky. And now, it felt alive again. Restoring the mansion became a labor of love, not just for me, but for the community that had watched and waited. Neighbors stopped by to help with landscaping, painting, and repairs. Some brought tools. Others brought meals. Even a few former HOA victims came by to lend their support. By the time the mansion was fully restored, it looked like it had stepped out of a postcard. Lake blue walls gleamed under the sun. The dock was sturdy and polished, the boathouse straightened, and the porch lights sparkled like tiny stars. But the greatest restoration wasn't just physical. It was emotional. I remember standing on the porch that first evening after the restoration, looking out over the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the fiery sky of sunset. I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the breeze. Respect isn't given. It's earned. And I realized I had earned it. Not through money or threats, but through persistence, honesty, an unwavering commitment to family legacy. Karen had been exposed. The HOA had been humbled, and the mansion, the heart of my family, had been saved. It wasn't just about winning, it was about remembering why we fight, why we hold on to family. Tradition and dignity. Why standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they seem, matters. Because sometimes the smallest acts of courage echo through generations. And as I stood there, breathing in the fresh lake air, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace, a sense that no one could ever take this house. This legacy for me, not Karen, not the HOA, not anyone, this was ours. And now it would remain ours. That night, I invited a few neighbors over to celebrate. We lit lanterns on the dock, the warm glow reflecting in the water. We shared stories of summers gone by, of struggles faced, and of victories won. Some laughed, some cried. Some shook their heads in disbelief at the chaos we had survived. And in that moment, I realized that a home is more than walls and floors. It's memories, love, family, community, and protecting that is worth every battle. Before the evening ended, I stepped out onto the porch one last time. The lake sparkled, the mansion glowed under the lanterns, and the air smelled of pine and fresh paint. I turned to the camera of my little vlogging setup, the one I'd used to document the restoration. "Remember?" I said. Voice steady, eyes shining. Standing up for what's right isn't always easy. Bullies will try to scare you. Entitled neighbors will try to make rules that don't exist. But the truth is your strongest weapon. Fight for family. Fight for legacy. And never let anyone tell you what you can or cannot do on your own property. I smiled. And if you have your own HOA nightmare story or a Karen tale, share it in the comments. Let's stand together. Because together, we can make sure justice is always stronger than greed. Then I held up my hand and said with a grin, "And don't forget to subscribe." You never know what other HOA horrors or victories we'll uncover next. The camera clicked off. The mansion stood behind me, strong and proud. The lake reflected the final rays of sunlight. And I finally felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The house was back. The family's pride restored. Justice served, and no HOA or Karen would ever touch it again. Life lesson: sometimes the fight isn't about money. It's about dignity, about family, about standing for what is right, even when everyone else doubts you. True respect is earned by defending what matters most. And if you ever feel powerless, remember, persistence, truth, and courage can topple even the most intimidating foes. Please subscribe my channel.